Hello, you are listening to the Mongols podcast. This is Samwise J. Morgenstern, otherwise known as the Ano Shialich, and I'm here with...
Me!
Jaybird.
Yes, me. Hello.
The non-existent... Yep. The non-existent invisible voice of this podcast that sometimes pops in every now and then.
Yes.
Sadly, we cannot get a hold of Bijubi, but hopefully by next episode we shall have her again.
Yeah.
Anyways, today our topic is, for Season 2, Episode 1, how the heck does mounted archery actually work?
Question we all need answered.
Yeah, so now it's kind of a bit of a disclaimer. I'm not going off of too much of like the sources from the 15th or 16th century when the Mongols were like actually doing their stuff. Because keep in mind, the Mongols didn't exactly write down manuals for how to actually shoot a bow from horseback. That's more of what was actually done by the Ottoman and Ming and Qing empires. So, but before we do that, I have to kind of backtrack to how did we exactly get to the composite bow? Because you can't just take any old bow and shoot it off of horseback.
No, you cannot.
So, let's begin. This is probably about early Bronze Age, and of course the bow is a very ancient invention going all the way back to the Stone Age. And at least at the start of the Bronze Age, we have mostly self-bows, which means that they're made of precisely one long piece of wood. Now, the problem with the one long piece of wood is that it's not as strong as it could be, and you have to make it like very long for it to like keep up its strength and keep on shooting. So naturally, a shorter bow won't have as much strength, and when you try to put it back, it will probably snap.
Yes, you don't want that.
So naturally, somewhere around the mid to late Bronze Age, they come up with a whole new idea, at least on the steps, of actually making a composite bow, meaning that you have multiple materials, specifically wood, horn, and sinew, with a lot of glue, especially to get the sinew attached to the wood. This will make the bow actually a whole lot stronger. That means you can have actually more power than the self bows, but in a lot smaller size. And that's very important, because suddenly you can shoot the bow off of a moving platform and have a very strong bow for that purpose.
Yes, very handy.
Of course, with
I know such things.
Of course, the problem with that mobile platform currently is that it's not bred into existence yet. The horses aren't bred enough to be strong enough to actually take on the full weight of a human. They're still being domesticated to the point where they can't. So naturally, some steppe peoples, like for example the Scythians and the Cimmerians, actually come up with the chariot. And then the chariot gets transported by the Hyksos to Egypt, and that's where they come up with not only the composite bow and the chariot, but the whole full system of everything. And that's very important. But also, don't think that we've got the full recurve bow yet. We don't have the full like recurve bow that the Mongols are famous for yet, because actually the Egyptians are stuck with what I would say is a slightly weaker model. It's still a composite bow though. This is known as the angular bow. If you ever actually like look it up, like Mike Lodes has thrown this up and used it a million times. It's a very weird shape, and it doesn't look like it could work, but it totally does. It's quite amazing, needless to say. And the Egyptians run with that for hundreds upon hundreds of years, right up until about the Sea People's Age, when it is, yeah, right up until the Bronze Age collapsed. So, and slowly over time, the angular bow is actually dropped for what is known as the Scythian bow. And the Scythian bow is officially what I like to call the first full recurve bow. You kind of get the familiar shape of it curves up here, then to the horn, and then it curves all the way down here, and then curves down here. And the main strength of that is that you can actually have a longer draw. So the longer the draw, that means the bigger arrow you can shoot and the more range you can also have, which is really nice.
Yeah.
But there is a bit of a further division that will eventually make the Mongol bow somewhat unique amongst the various steppe tribes that actually use composite bows. And this is what I like to call the comparison of a contact versus non-contact. So the thing about a composite bow with horns and a recurve thing is that the horn actually curves out, and you have to think when you're hooking the string onto that end of the bow itself. Are you going to let it make contact with the back of the horn, or are you not? And the Mongols and some other people specifically go with the idea of, yes, we are. We are going to have that. And in fact, in order to facilitate that, we're going to have this little tab at the end of at the back end of the horn, so that the string can be attached there. And this gives actually even more power. The problem with that is that at the other end of the horn, the bowstring can actually slip off sometimes, and that's not exactly helpful when you're an archer.
No, very not helpful.
But with all these intricate materials and all this way of making it, that means that making composite bows ain't cheap, and it takes a very long process, about a year. And you have to get...
It's not exactly mass production yet.
Thankfully, the materials are pretty readily available if you're a steppe warrior. Most of the wood usually is maple, and that is known as a bit more adhesive than other common bow woods, such as yew, especially if you're familiar with like the English longbow. And for the horn specifically, they keep on going with a water buffalo, which is interesting considering that the water buffalo is kind of not in traditional Mongolian homeland range, but it's close enough that trade will branch the rest, usually.
Yes.
And the sinew is usually from the cattle, so that means, well, that's readily available because Mongols are herdsters first and foremost, and they're not trying to pillage you. So, good stuff right there.
Yeah.
But there's another thing with having to shoot your bow off of horseback. You're not actually using your pointer finger and middle finger to pull back the bow. This is what is traditionally known in archery as a Mediterranean draw. The Mongols actually go with something different. They actually take the thumb and they use that to hold up the arrow and pull back the bowstring. And that's very important because you're actually shooting on the right side of the bow, whereas in most forms of archery you're shooting on the left side. With the right side you can shoot with a bit more speed. But you can also have the chance of it going out this way, and the thumb draw actually helps you hold it a bit more in the right way. But there's another bit of myth busting that I'm going to have to do before I go forward. It's commonly stated in some history books that stirrups enable mounted archery. This is absolutely positively not true, and if I hear this again, I will find that publisher and throw him out the window. Because I'm so pissed. You don't need it. The Huns proved that. The Scythians proved that. They didn't have stirrups. They did the stuff. They shot the bow off of horseback.
You never need an excuse to defenestrate someone, to be fair.
True. And you also don't need a stirrup to do the lance, because this is another myth at least put forth by people about medieval cavalry. I'm not exactly naming anyone specific because this is a very common myth that you need stirrups to actually do lances, you need stirrups to do mounted archery. You do not. You can actually do a bareback, believe it or not. But there is actually one benefit of stirrups, as far as I know from my research. you can actually shoot a heavier bow off of horseback. That means you can shoot a bigger arrow over a longer range, and that means more hurt for the guys who was on the business end of the arrow. Not a good place to be. And there's...
Never really want to an arrow, in my experience.
But there's also another thing, so you don't always actually shoot the arrow at full gallop. So usually when you're riding up to the enemy and about to load and fire your bow, the horses of the steppe are actually taught to do this sort of fifth gait, which is known as the amble. That means it's kind of between the trot and the gallop. It's not as fast as the gallop, but it's faster than the trot. And this is about at the 10 to 15 mile per hour range-ish. And that's where you shoot off the arrow and it hits someone. But when you are actually doing the notorious parting shot, you are absolutely going full gallop because you're trying to get away from the guy who's trying to ride you down. When you're going forward, you're basically not afraid of people running you down. But when you've harassed them with your arrows from the front, you need to now turn around to get the heck away. And the parting shot is actually something that has become part of the language as sort of, this is my last stuff before I leave the room. And this actually comes from a very famous steppe tribe / steppe empire known as the Parthians, who were often the enemy of the Roman Empire. And the Romans called this the Parthian shot because because the Romans would be standing in their squares with their scutums ready, and then the Parthians would be shooting arrows from here, and then they would be turning around and making that famous Parthian shot. Now, it wasn't exclusively Parthian, and this had been around before then, but the Parthians really made it famous in the Western record, so that's kind of what we're calling it. And that's where you get parting shot. Cool history.
The Parthians also killed Cassius?
What? What about Parthians?
Cassius.
Yeah, they had a lot of dealings with the Romans. Cassius? Yeah, he was on the. Oh yeah, that was he was at the battle with Crassus, where Crassus's army totally got annihilated. Well, Cassius was one of Crassus's underlings, like second in command or something like that.
Getting their names mixed up. It's been a long time.
Yeah, the famous Battle of Carrhae. It's one of the greatest Roman defeats. But, of course, that's not the end of the whole archery thing. If you're wondering how much more expensive and complicated we can make mounted archery, we have multiple arrowheads now, so there's that. So, obviously, many of the longbow people will probably be more familiar with what is known as the bodkin point. Think of this like a needle. It is very much designed to go into armor, but keep in mind, you're not going to send this through metal armor. You probably have a better shot at actually sending this through chainmail, for example. And then there's another bit of an armor-piercing arrow known as what is known as the lozenge shape, which is a bit broader than the bodkin, but has the purpose of, I'm going to go through leather armor and absolutely wreck it. And then amongst some steppe peoples, not necessarily the Mongols, they have what is known as a tanged head for the bamboo. I'll pull it up in the visual version when I have the YouTube video of this. And then we have a barbed arrowhead, which is really a monster that is meant for shooting horses, because good luck pulling the barbed arrow out of your bleeding and dying horse. Animal cruelty, yay.
That should have been. That is just.
And then there is actually another thing that is often known as the crescent head. Now, this isn't what you're supposed to be actually using in combat, because that's not a good call, because it's not going to go through armor. But here's what it is going to catch. A bird. So basically it's bird shot. And another head that's going around is the trilobate. I'll also be pulling this up in the YouTube version. And this is to make wounds even worse because it actually splits up everything. It's really hard to stitch the wound back together. That means you're more likely to bleed out, more likely to get the wound infected, and, well, there you go, you die. Yeah. But one of the other big arrowheads that's running around is specifically the what is known as the Qing plum, and it's kind of a very pointy. It's a somewhat pointy plum arrow, and it's meant to be somewhat heavy, but also max penetration. This is mainly used by the Qing while they're on foot because they have both infantry archers and mounted archers. But one of the other things that's actually quite important about the composite bow is that that is specifically the drawway. You can't exactly pull a long bow off of horseback and actually shoot the arrow. Although you can with some training, but it's just a lot easier to do with a smaller bow that's a little weaker. Specifically, as far as I know, this has been actually done on live TV by the famous Mike Lodes. He's a very famous military historian. He can do all sorts of things. He even shoot longbows off of horseback, apparently, which is quite impressive because that's not supposed to be done. He's even come up with a theory that this was actually done during the 100 Years' War. Some other people are a bit more skeptical of this. I definitely am because it doesn't show up in the iconography, but since he has shown it to be done, I wouldn't be surprised if we someday find some medieval iconography of English longbowmen somehow managing to make the shot off of horseback.
I would not be surprised, given the long nature of them. Someone's had to do it at some point.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me. But the thing is, with the vast decline that I mentioned last episode in just normal Mongolian culture of not using the mounted archery and various other steppe tribes assimilating, that means mounted archery is actually being dropped in a lot of places. It's being dropped and it's being forgotten, in the sense of there aren't exactly manuals. Many of us, perhaps sword people, would be a bit more used to finding manuals from, let's say, Liberi or Fiore that tell you exactly how to swing the sword, how to respond to this cut and that cut. Mounted archery doesn't exactly have this sort of luxury because most of the practitioners are just like, why do I need to write this down? We'll just pass it on to the kids when they're like 5 years old, and we'll teach them to ride when they're 3.
That never works out well.
Especially in the late 17th century when the bow is actually being dropped in place for the matchlock musket, which is really weird considering that you cannot fire a musket off of horseback. Good luck!
I tried once, it wasn't very successful.
Yeah, I can imagine. Because it's really hard to aim, the barrel's just way too dang long, and it just takes forever to load. But there's actually been a bit of a comeback for mounted archery because it is actually a sport, and as far as I know, they're trying to get to the Olympics, although it hasn't gotten there yet. And specifically, we can actually point back to a fairly famous Hungarian known as Lajos Kásai. If you ever look up videos of him on YouTube, this guy's an absolute beast. He can just shoot off arrows one after the other. And that actually leads me to another trick of the trade when it comes to mounted archery. You don't actually pull the arrow from the quiver when you're reloading. That's very important. You actually take about 5 to 10 arrows and you put them in your left hand, which is also the hand that's holding your bow. So when you need to reload, you just go over to your left hand, pull the arrow out, knock it, wading, done. And that increases your speed, make sure that the arrows just keep on coming, and Your enemy keeps on turning into a giant pincushion. And Kossuth Lajos, as a young kid, he was born in 1960 in Kaposvár, Hungary, and that means Hungary's not doing so hot because communism happened.
Yeah, Hungary's been in a bad state for a while.
But one of the few lucky things that Kossuth was able to do was that he actually picked up a book by Gárdonyi Géza, which is known in English as Invisible Man. In Hungarian, it's known as Láthatatlan Ember. And this is actually a novel about the Hunnic Empire. This is mainly because the entirety of Hungarian culture is basically, we're the brothers of the Huns and we totally came back to Hungary after about 400 years after we left. I'm not so believing in that myth, because we don't exactly have the genetic proof of Hungarians being linked to Huns. We don't even know actually what the Huns looked like, so even more confusing details. And so that means like the only things that we're actually sharing, and that us Hungarians are actually sharing with the Huns, as far as I know, are basically, we have about the same bow, a fairly similar culture with a pastoral lifestyle, and can shoot bows off horseback. But that doesn't mean that we are necessarily related to each other and managed to actually live together for however long before we reached the Carpathian Basin. But anyways, Kossuth was had his imagination fired by reading Invisible Man, and he wanted to be basically a modern-day Hun. The problem was, well, the Hungarians had basically forgotten about mounted archery since the 11th century, so and there were no manuals that were available to him at the time, so how do you basically reconstruct mounted archery from scratch? So he worked himself up in the system, got to owning a reasonable plot of land somewhere around Kaposvár, and he got himself a reasonably fine steed, and by the 1980s he was experimenting with various different types of bow. And he didn't know too much about the Huns, so he didn't know how to make composite bows yet, but eventually he came around that, and he was also taking writing lessons and archery lessons, and he was really good at the archery and writing stuff, but he couldn't exactly merge them together. And initially one of his early ideas was that he was going to kind of fast-track that with some modern tech, like, for example, a laser pointer. The problem with the laser pointer is it bounces off. It just completely goes all over hexav acre once the moment the horse moves. And then good luck aiming. Good luck. So Kossuth was like, laser pointer? Yeet! Over there. I need to do something else. And he decided, well, it's probably best if I just feel the moment when I need to loose the arrows, in a manner of speaking. And he would just look for the right moment to release the bow and then wading. And then he would just go for the arrow from essentially a hand of arrows and just shoot again. And he began to set not only a lot of records, he also began to study other forms of mounted archery that managed to survive the centuries, like, for example, Zen archery over in Japan. Because, if you're wondering, the samurai, while they loved the katana, they're originally taught to be mounted archers. This is partly to imitate the Mongols.
Didn't they just die in a tornado when the Mongols came?
Well, yes, but the Mongols also had a few fights with the Japanese, and the Japanese were like, holy crap, this mounted archery system is actually kind of cool. Nobody minds if we copy that. So they became mounted archers, especially since their swords weren't exactly of the absolute best quality.
Yeah.
But anyways, Kossuth, after he learned Zen archery and started figuring out how to do mounted archery at home in Hungary, he began to also set an absolute lot of records, and he also began to take on students to actually teach how to do mounted archery. And this means that his students are basically all over the place. They are in Canada, they are in the US, they're all over Europe, and there's all sorts of camps where you can just find a Kashai school teacher, and they will teach you how to shoot a bow off horseback. But his primary base is still over in the same land that he purchased during communist Hungary, which is known as Kaposmeri. And, well, that's kind of it on mounted archery. But that's essentially like how it works, how it evolved through the centuries, and kind of how exactly did the Mongols do their stuff with a contact recurve composite bow. Anyways, but before we go, here's where you can find at least this podcast. I have a Patreon over at Samurai J. Morgenstern. You can also find me on Facebook at History with Samurai J. Morgenstern. You can also tweet me at YoungBards101. J. Burke, we will not be able to find you because you do not exist.
No, I do not. You can't find me anywhere, so don't bother looking.
And as for Bijubi, I'll put the link to her Tumblr in the description, and I will also be putting the link to my Tumblr at GoSJM42 Mongol History. You can also support us here on Anchor Podcasts.
Where she's here, where she is.
Who?
Yes, she's on Discord.
But
Oh, well, anyway.
yeah. So, but anyways, also with our Patreon tier, we have each tier currently named after the last three sons of Genghis via Borte. So the Tolui tier is specifically you get to get a shout out in our videos and also early access. With the Okudai tier, which is the $5 tier, you get the same benefits as the Tolui tier, but you also get a short story with a fan fiction character that you have, and you can also vote in the polls.
Is that what we're doing?
Yep, very nice stuff. And
Yeah.
but since this is a democracy and you can vote in the polls, we also need to have polls. So the Chagatai tier at the $10 can also suggest polls and will have the same benefits as the Ogode tier. And I'll of course be suggesting my own stuff. I'm trying to figure out what would be a good bunch of benefits for the Jochi tier. Maybe I'll just put up like a poll later for that. But anyways, this has been the Mongols podcast. Absolutely love you guys. And Jay Burke, this has been Samurai J. Morgenstern. Bye.
Yeah.
You will also be able to find the YouTube version of this video on my channel, Samurai J. Morgenstern. This podcast was done with the aid of Mike Loach's book, The Composite Bow. And that is the end of our talk on mounted archery. Next time we will be attempting to talk about the secret history of the Mongols and the history of the world conquered by Juveni with a very special guest that you already know of, our amazing Jackmeister. Thank you for listening to the Mongols podcast today. Please like and subscribe to the channel if you are watching the YouTube version. Have a good day. You will also be able to find the YouTube version of this video on my channel, Samurai J. Morgenstern. This podcast was done with the aid of Mike Loach's book, The Composite Bow, and that is the end of our talk on mounted archery. Next time, we will be attempting to talk about the secret history of the Mongols and the history of the world conquered by Juvayni, with a very special guest that you already know of, our amazing Jackmeister. Thank you for listening to the Mongols podcast today. Please like and subscribe to the channel if you are watching the YouTube version. Have a good day.